The old brass bell above the door chimed softly as Harold Washington pushed through the entrance of Betty's Corner Diner. His worn leather shoes moved slowly across the checkered linoleum floor, the rubber tip of his walking cane tapping out a familiar rhythm. At 90 years old, Harold had perfected the art of taking his time. "Morning, Mr. Washington," called out Lisa from behind the counter. She was already reaching for the coffee pot, knowing exactly what he wanted. Black coffee, no sugar, no cream. The same order he'd been placing every Tuesday morning for the past 15 years. Harold raised his weathered hand in greeting, his smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. The purple heart pin on his cardigan caught the morning light streaming through the window. He'd worn that pin every day since they gave it to him in Korea, back when the world was a different place and he was a different man. The corner booth was waiting for him, just like always. Betty, the owner, had started calling it Harold's Table about 10 years ago. Nobody else sat there on Tuesday mornings. It wasn't an official rule or anything, just one of those unspoken agreements that made small communities special. Harold settled into the worn vinyl seat with a soft grunt. His knees weren't what they used to be, and mornings were getting harder. But Tuesday breakfast at Betty's wasn't just about the food. It was about routine, about belonging somewhere, about having a place where people knew your name and your story. Lisa appeared with his coffee before he could even ask. Steam rose from the white ceramic mug, mixing the rich smell of fresh coffee with the familiar diner aromas of bacon grease and toast. She set down a folded newspaper beside his plate. "Scrambled eggs and wheat toast coming right up," she said, even though he hadn't ordered yet. After 15 years, why bother with the formalities? Harold unfolded the local paper and adjusted his reading glasses. The headlines were the usual mix of local politics and community events. The high school football team had won their homecoming game. The mayor was proposing new parking meters downtown. Mrs. Peterson's cat had been found safe after going missing for 3 days. Simple news for simple people living simple lives. Harold liked it that way. From his corner booth, he could see the whole diner. There was Bob Mitchell at the counter, complaining about his property taxes while working his way through a stack of pancakes. 3 booths over, 2 retired teachers were solving the world's problems over coffee and Danish pastries. Near the window, a young mother was cutting up pancakes for her toddler, who was more interested in making syrup art than eating. This was Harold's world now, not the frozen hills of Korea where he'd earned his Purple Heart, not the decades he'd spent working at the post office, sorting mail and watching his community grow and change. Just this warm, familiar diner where everyone knew he'd served his country and respected him for it. The eggs arrived perfectly scrambled, just the way he liked them. Not too dry, not too wet. Lisa had been making them the same way for years, and she'd gotten it down to a science. The wheat toast was golden brown with just enough butter to make it taste right without making it soggy. Harold ate slowly, savoring each bite. At his age, rushing through meals seemed pointless. Besides, he had nowhere else to be. His wife Dorothy had passed 5 years ago, and their children lived in different states with families of their own. Tuesday mornings at Betty's had become the highlight of his week. "How's everything tasting today, Mr. Washington?" Lisa asked during one of her rounds. "Perfect as always," Harold replied, dabbing his mouth with the paper napkin. "You tell Betty she's got the best cook in 3 counties," Lisa laughed. "I'll make sure she hears that. She's in the back doing inventory, but she always asks how you're doing." It was true. Betty Henderson had owned the diner for 23 years, and she took pride in knowing her regular customers. When Harold's wife was sick, Betty had sent soup home with him every Tuesday. When Dorothy passed, Betty had closed the diner early to attend the funeral. These weren't just business relationships. They were real friendships built over shared meals and countless conversations. Harold finished his breakfast and pulled out his wallet. The leather was cracked and soft with age, worn smooth by decades of use. Inside, tucked behind his driver's license, was a small black and white photo of his unit from Korea. 22 young men standing in the snow, their faces serious but their eyes still full of hope. He was the only one left now. The bill was always the same, $8.50 for eggs, toast, and coffee. Harold left a $10 bill on the table like he always did. Lisa had stopped trying to give him exact change years ago. "See you next Tuesday." "Mr. Washington," she called as he made his way to the door. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, stepping back into the morning sunshine. The walk to his car took a few minutes. Harold didn't mind. The autumn air felt good in his lungs. And the familiar sounds of the neighborhood, dogs barking, lawnmowers humming, children playing, reminded him why he'd chosen to stay in this small town after retiring. As he drove home, Harold thought about how much his life had changed over the years. The young soldier who'd fought in Korea could never have imagined becoming this old man with his weekly routine and simple pleasures. But there was something comforting about the predictability of it all. Betty's corner diner, Lisa's friendly smile, the same breakfast every Tuesday morning. It wasn't a grand life, but it was his life. And after everything he'd been through, the war, the years of hard work, the loss of friends and family, these quiet moments felt like a reward he'd earned. Harold pulled into his driveway and sat in the car for a moment, thinking about next Tuesday's breakfast. Same time, same table, same order. Some people might call it boring, but Harold called it perfect. He had no way of knowing that next Tuesday would be different, that the routine he'd built over 15 years would be shattered by the very people who were supposed to protect and serve. That his quiet corner booth would become the center of a storm that would reach all the way to Washington, D.C. For now, though Harold Washington was just a 90-year-old veteran enjoying his weekly breakfast, surrounded by people who respected him and valued his presence in their small community, it was enough. It was everything. Tuesday morning started like any other for Harold Washington. The same sunrise through his bedroom window, the same cup of instant coffee while watching the morning news, the same careful routine of getting dressed and ready for his weekly trip to Betty's Corner Diner. At exactly 9:15 a.m., Harold pushed through the familiar glass door. The bell chimed its greeting and Lisa waved from behind the counter. Everything was normal, predictable, safe. Just the way Harold liked it. He settled into his corner booth and unfolded the morning paper. The coffee appeared without him asking, steam rising from the white mug like a small prayer of gratitude. Outside, the October morning was crisp and bright, with golden leaves dancing in the breeze. Harold was halfway through reading about the upcoming town council meeting when he heard Lisa's voice change. There was something different in her tone, sharper, more cautious. "Can I help you, officers?" Harold looked up from his newspaper to see two police officers standing just inside the door. They were young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of serious expressions that meant business. The taller one had pale skin and short blonde hair. His partner was stockier with dark hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to scan the diner like he was looking for trouble. "We got a call about a suspicious person," the blonde officer said, his hand resting on his radio. "Someone reported an elderly man who's been loitering here for a while." Lisa's eyebrows shot up in confusion. "Loitering? Sir, I'm not sure what you mean. All our customers are welcome here as long as they want to stay." Harold felt a strange chill run down his spine. Something about this felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on what. He'd seen police officers in the diner before. They sometimes stopped by for coffee and donuts. But this felt different. Tense, aggressive. The stocky officer's eyes swept across the restaurant, taking in Bob Mitchell at the counter, the two retired teachers in their booth, the young mother feeding her toddler. Then his gaze stopped on Harold. "That him?" he asked his partner, nodding toward the corner booth. Harold's hands tightened on his newspaper. He'd been sitting here for maybe 20 minutes, doing exactly what he'd done every Tuesday for 15 years, reading the paper, drinking coffee, eating breakfast. Nothing suspicious about any of it. Lisa stepped forward, her voice firm but polite. "Officers, that's Mr. Washington. He's been coming here every Tuesday morning for 15 years. He's one of our most valued customers and a Korean War veteran." The blonde officer ignored her completely. Instead, he started walking toward Harold's table, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor. His partner followed close behind, their presence suddenly filling the small diner with tension. Harold folded his newspaper carefully and set it beside his coffee cup. His Purple Heart pin caught the light as he straightened in his seat, drawing himself up with the dignity that had carried him through 9 decades of life. "Good morning, officers," Harold said quietly. "Is there something I can help you with?" The blonde officer stopped beside the booth, looking down at Harold with suspicious eyes. "We need to see some identification, sir. We've had reports of someone matching your description causing problems in the area." Harold blinked in surprise. "Problems? Officer, I've been sitting here having breakfast. I come here every Tuesday morning. I haven't caused any problems." "That's what they all say." the stocky officer muttered, earning a sharp look from Lisa. The young waitress stepped closer to the booth, her voice rising slightly. Officers, there's obviously been some kind of mistake. Mr. Washington is a regular customer. He's never caused any trouble here ever. But the officers weren't listening to her. The blonde one leaned down slightly, his voice taking on an edge that made other diners start to pay attention. Sir, I'm going to need you to produce some identification right now, and I want to know exactly what you're doing here and how long you've been sitting in this booth. Harold felt something cold settle in his stomach. In all his 90 years, through war and peace, through the civil rights movement and decades of social change, he'd hoped those days were behind him. Days when the color of his skin made him automatically suspicious. Days when being in the wrong place at the wrong time could mean trouble, even when you'd done absolutely nothing wrong. I'm having breakfast, Harold said slowly, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. Same as I do every Tuesday morning. Same booth, same time, same order. These folks here can tell you that. Several other diners were watching now, their conversations dying away as the tension in the room became impossible to ignore. Bob Mitchell had turned around on his counterstool, his face showing the same confusion everyone else was feeling. The stocky officer crossed his arms over his chest. Look, old man, we don't have time for games. Someone called in a complaint about a suspicious person and you match the description. Now, are you going to cooperate? Or are we going to have a problem? Harold's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet. Not from fear, from anger. Pure, righteous anger at being treated like a criminal for the crime of eating breakfast while black. He pulled out his driver's license and set it on the table. There's your identification, officer. Harold Washington, same address I've had for 32 years. Same as it says on my voter registration, my veterans benefits paperwork, and every other document that proves I'm a law-abiding citizen who served his country. The blonde officer picked up the license and studied it, like he was looking for evidence of forgery. It says here you're 90 years old. That's right, pretty spry for 90. What are you really doing here? Lisa had heard enough. She stepped between the officers and the booth, her face flushed with anger. What he's doing here is eating breakfast. The same breakfast he orders every Tuesday morning. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee. He tips well, he's polite to everyone, and he's never caused 1 second of trouble in 15 years. The stocky officer turned his attention to her. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and let us handle this situation. What situation? Lisa demanded. An old man eating breakfast? That's your big emergency? Harold could see other customers starting to pull out their phones. The young mother had stopped feeding her toddler and was watching with wide eyes. The retired teachers were whispering to each other, their faces showing the same disbelief everyone else was feeling. This was supposed to be his safe place. His corner booth in a friendly diner where everyone knew his name and respected his service to his country. Instead, it was turning into something ugly and familiar, something he'd hoped he'd never have to face again. The blonde officer handed back his license. Mr. Washington, we're going to need you to stand up. We have to search you to make sure you're not carrying any weapons or contraband. The words hit Harold like a physical blow. Stand up, be searched. In front of everyone he'd shared breakfast with for 15 years. Treated like a criminal because someone, somewhere, had decided that an old black man sitting in a diner was suspicious enough to call the police. Harold looked around the restaurant at faces he'd known for years. Lisa, who'd served him coffee every Tuesday morning. Bob, who'd nodded respectfully at his Purple Heart pin. The retired teachers who'd thanked him for his service. The young mother who'd smiled when he'd waved at her toddler. They were all watching now. All seeing Harold Washington, Korean War veteran, reduced to this moment of humiliation. And there wasn't a thing he could do to stop it. Harold Washington had faced enemy fire in the frozen mountains of Korea. He'd stood his ground when bullets whizzed past his head and mortar shells shook the earth beneath his feet. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. Being ordered to stand and submit to a search in front of people who'd known and respected him for 15 years. I'm not carrying any weapons. Officers, Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. I'm a 90-year-old man having breakfast. What possible threat could I pose? The stocky officer stepped closer to the booth. Sir, are you refusing to cooperate with a police investigation? I'm not refusing anything, Harold replied. I'm just trying to understand why I'm being treated like a criminal for eating scrambled eggs. Lisa moved to stand beside the booth, her face red with anger. This is absolutely ridiculous. Mr. Washington comes here every week. He's never done anything wrong. He's a war hero, for crying out loud. The blonde officer turned to her with cold eyes. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to step back and stay out of this. This is police business. Police business. Lisa's voice rose higher. Harassing an elderly veteran is police business? Around the diner, other customers were pulling out their cell phones. The retired teacher named Mrs. Chen held hers up, clearly recording. Bob Mitchell had his phone out too, shaking his head in disbelief. You folks need to put those phones away, the stocky officer barked. This is an ongoing investigation. Mrs. Chen spoke up from her booth. It's perfectly legal to record police officers in public spaces, officer. I taught civics for 30 years. The blonde officer's jaw tightened. He turned back to Harold, his patience clearly running thin. Mr. Washington, I'm ordering you to stand up right now. If you refuse to comply, we'll have to use other methods to ensure our safety and the safety of everyone in this establishment. Harold felt his heart pounding in his chest. Other methods. He knew what that meant. At his age, with his bad knees and arthritic hands, any kind of physical confrontation could be dangerous, maybe even deadly. Slowly, painfully, Harold began to slide out of the booth. His walking cane clattered to the floor as he struggled to stand, his joints protesting after sitting for so long. The simple act of getting to his feet, something that was difficult on the best of days, became a humiliating spectacle under the watchful eyes of two suspicious police officers. Take your time, old man, the stocky officer said sarcastically. We've got all day. Lisa bent to pick up Harold's cane, her hands shaking with anger. Show some respect. This man fought for your freedom. Harold finally managed to stand, swaying slightly as he found his balance. At 6 feet tall, he'd once been an imposing figure. But 9 decades of life had bent his shoulders and curved his spine. Still, he drew himself up as straight as he could, trying to maintain some dignity in an utterly undignified situation. Turn around and put your hands on the table, the blonde officer commanded. Harold's eyes swept across the diner one more time. Every person in the place was watching him. Some looked angry, some shocked, some just sad. The young mother had covered her toddler's eyes, not wanting the child to see an elderly man being treated this way. Bob Mitchell stood up from his counter stool. Come on, officers. This is Harold Washington. He's been coming here longer than some of you have been alive. Can't you see this is all just a big misunderstanding? Sir, sit back down, the stocky officer ordered. Unless you want to be arrested for interfering with a police investigation. Harold placed his weathered hands flat on the table, the same table where he'd eaten thousands of breakfast over the years. The vinyl was warm under his palms, worn smooth by countless other hands. He stared down at his unfinished eggs, now cold and congealing on the white plate. The blonde officer moved behind him and began patting down his cardigan. Harold closed his eyes, trying to block out the whispers and murmurs from other customers. The officer's hands were rough and thorough, checking pockets that contained nothing more dangerous than reading glasses and throat lozenges. What's this? The officer asked, his fingers finding Harold's purple heart pin. It's a Purple Heart, Harold said quietly. I received it in Korea in 1952. The officer unpinned it from Harold's cardigan and held it up to the light, examining it like it might be fake. The small piece of metal and ribbon represented pain, sacrifice, and service to country. To Harold, it was one of his most treasured possessions. To the officer, it was just another object to be scrutinized with suspicion. Lot of fake military stuff out there these days, the stocky officer commented. People buy this junk at pawn shops and pretend to be heroes. The words hit Harold harder than any physical blow could have. In that moment, surrounded by people who knew him and respected him, he was being accused of lying about his military service, of pretending to be something he wasn't, of wearing honors he hadn't earned. Mrs. Chen's voice cut through the silence. That man has more integrity in his little finger than both of you have in your entire bodies. How dare you question his service record? Ma'am, one more outburst and you'll be arrested for disturbing the peace, the blonde officer warned, still holding Harold's Purple Heart. Lisa stepped forward again, her eyes blazing. Give him back his pin. He earned that in combat. He was wounded defending this country. The officer finished his search of Harold's cardigan and moved to his pants pockets. The indignity of it was overwhelming. A 90-year-old, War veteran being treated like a common criminal while eating breakfast in a place where he was loved and respected. Nothing here, the officer announced, sounding almost disappointed. He handed the Purple Heart back to Harold, who accepted it with trembling fingers. Harold pinned it back to his cardigan, his movements slow and deliberate. The small piece of metal felt heavier than usual, weighted down by the humiliation of having its authenticity questioned by someone who'd probably never served a day in uniform. "Satisfied?" Harold asked quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The stocky officer crossed his arms. "We still haven't established what you're doing here or why someone would call in a complaint about you." "I told you," Harold said, his patience finally beginning to fray. "I'm having breakfast, same as I do every Tuesday morning. Same booth, same time, same order. Ask anyone here." "Maybe you're getting argumentative with the staff," the blonde officer suggested. "Maybe you're making other customers uncomfortable with your presence." The suggestion was so absurd that several customers actually gasped. Lisa threw her hands up in frustration. "Argumentative? Mr. Washington is the politest customer we have. He says please and thank you. He never complains about anything. And he tips better than most people half his age." Bob Mitchell had heard enough. He stood up from his stool and walked over to the booth, his face set with determination. "Officers, I've been coming to this diner for 8 years. I've sat next to Harold Washington dozens of times. He's never been anything but kind and respectful. He talks about his late wife, his grandchildren, and his garden. He asks about my family and remembers details from week to week. If you think this man is a threat to anyone, you're not just wrong, you're dangerous." The young mother at the window booth spoke up too, her voice shaking with emotion. "My son waves at Mr. Washington every time we're here. He always waves back and smiles. What kind of suspicious person takes time to be kind to children?" Harold felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Not from sadness, but from gratitude. These people, his breakfast companions for all these years, were standing up for him. They were risking their own confrontations with police officers to defend his character and his right to eat breakfast in peace. But the officers weren't listening to character witnesses. They seemed determined to find something wrong, something that would justify the call that had brought them here. The blonde officer pulled out his notepad. "Mr. Washington, I'm going to need you to explain your actions this morning in detail. What time did you arrive? Who did you talk to? What did you order? Why did you choose to sit in this particular booth?" Harold looked at the officer with a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. After 90 years of life, after serving his country in war, after decades of being a model citizen, he was being interrogated about the crime of eating breakfast while black. The realization hit him like a cold wind. This wasn't about suspicious behavior or public safety. This was about something much older and uglier, something he'd hoped America had moved beyond, but apparently hadn't. And in that moment, Harold Washington made a decision. He wasn't going to let this stand. Not anymore. Harold Washington sat in his living room chair, the same chair where he'd watched the evening news for the past 20 years. But today was different. Today, his hands were still shaking from what had happened at Betty's Corner Diner, and his mind was racing with thoughts he hadn't had in decades. The officers had finally left him alone after what felt like hours of questioning. They demanded to know why he came to the diner every Tuesday, who he talked to, what he ordered, even why he read the newspaper. Simple, innocent actions that had been twisted into something suspicious and threatening. Lisa had insisted on driving him home, her own hands shaking with anger as she helped him into her car. "Mr. Washington, I am so sorry," she'd said over and over. "That should never have happened, never." But it had happened. And now Harold sat alone in his quiet house, staring at a small worn address book that he hadn't opened in years. The book was black leather, cracked and faded with age. His late wife Dorothy had given it to him for Christmas in 1963, back when people still wrote addresses and phone numbers by hand. Most of the names inside belonged to people who were no longer living, old friends from the post office, neighbors who'd moved away, fellow veterans who'd fought alongside him in Korea. But some of the numbers were still good. Some of the names still mattered. Harold opened the book carefully, his arthritis making it difficult to turn the thin pages. He flipped past names from his civilian life and found what he was looking for. A section marked Military Contacts. During his time in Korea, Harold hadn't just been a regular infantry soldier. His education and communication skills had caught the attention of his commanding officers, and he'd spent the last year of his service working as a liaison between field units and headquarters. It was a job that required discretion, reliability, and absolute trustworthiness. More importantly, it was a job that had put him in contact with people who went on to have important careers in the military. People who remembered Harold Washington as a soldier who got things done without fanfare or complaint. His finger traced down a list of names until he found one that made his heart beat faster. General Robert Chen, Pentagon Veterans Affairs Liaison. Bobby Chen had been a young lieutenant when Harold first met him in Seoul. Fresh out of West Point, full of ideas about how to improve communication between combat units and command staff, Harold had taken the young officer under his wing, teaching him practical lessons about leadership that they didn't cover in military academies. Over the years, they'd stayed in touch through Christmas cards and the occasional letter. Harold had watched Bobby's career progress through the ranks, finally reaching the general stars that his talent and dedication had deserved. The last Christmas card had included a note. "If you ever need anything, Harold, you just call. I mean that." Harold stared at the phone number written in faded blue ink. It was probably outdated. Bobby was probably retired by now, living somewhere sunny and playing golf every day. Even if the number was still good, would he remember Harold after all these years? But what choice did he have? What had happened at the diner wasn't just about him. It was about respect for every veteran who'd ever worn the uniform. It was about the principle that service to your country should mean something, even if you're old and black and eating breakfast in a small-town diner. Harold picked up his phone, the old landline with the rotary dial that Dorothy had refused to replace even when everyone else went digital. His fingers, still shaking slightly, dialed the number slowly and carefully. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Harold was about to hang up when a crisp professional voice answered. "Pentagon Veterans Affairs Liaison Office, this is General Chen speaking." Harold nearly dropped the phone. After all these years, Bobby was still there, still serving, still the same confident voice that had once asked Harold how to earn the respect of soldiers twice his age. "Bobby," Harold said quietly, "this is Harold Washington, from Korea. I don't know if you remember me, but—" "Harold Washington?" The general's voice changed immediately, becoming warmer and more personal. "Of course I remember you. How could I forget the man who taught me everything I needed to know about real leadership? Harold, what a surprise. How are you doing?" For a moment, Harold couldn't speak. The kindness in Bobby's voice, the genuine pleasure at hearing from him, nearly broke through the emotional walls he'd built up over the morning's humiliation. Well, Bobby, I'm not doing too well today. I'm calling because something happened this morning that I thought you should know about." General Chen's tone shifted immediately. "What happened, Harold? Are you all right?" Harold took a deep breath and began to tell the story. He started with his usual Tuesday morning routine at Betty's Corner Diner, explained about the phone call reporting a suspicious person, and described the officer's treatment of him in front of people who'd known and respected him for years. He talked about being forced to stand and submit to a search while eating breakfast, about having his Purple Heart examined like it might be fake, about being questioned as if he were a criminal instead of a decorated veteran. General Chen listened without interruption, but Harold could hear the anger building in his voice with each detail. "They made you stand up and searched you? In public? Harold, you're a Purple Heart recipient. You served with distinction in combat. What possible justification could they have for treating you that way?" "I think we both know what the justification was, Bobby," Harold said quietly. "Same as it's always been. I was black and in a place where somebody thought I didn't belong." There was silence on the other end of the line for a long moment. When General Chen spoke again, his voice was tight with controlled fury. "Harold, I want you to give me every detail you can remember. The names of the officers if you got them. The badge numbers if you saw them. The name of the person who called in the complaint if anyone mentioned it. I want to know which police department this was and who their chief is." Harold provided what information he could, grateful that his memory for details was still sharp despite his age. General Chen took notes, asking specific questions about the timeline and the officer's behavior. "Harold, I need you to know that what happened to you today is completely unacceptable. Not just because you're a veteran, though that makes it worse, but because every American citizen has the right to eat breakfast in peace without being harassed by police officers." "I know that, Bobby. But knowing it and making it stop are two different things. Not this time, General Chen said, and Harold could hear the steel in his voice. Harold, you might not realize this, but I'm not just some desk general pushing papers around. The Veterans Affairs Liaison Office has direct communication with every major law enforcement agency in the country. We work with them on veteran-related issues, provide training, coordinate services. Harold felt a spark of hope for the first time since leaving the diner. What I'm telling you, General Chen continued, is that I'm about to make some phone calls that are going to make people very uncomfortable. Starting with the police chief who allowed his officers to treat a Korean War veteran like a common criminal. Bobby, I don't want special treatment just because I'm a veteran. I want fair treatment because I'm a human being. You're going to get both, General Chen said firmly. Harold, can you do me a favor? Can you write down everything that happened today while it's still fresh in your memory? Names, times, exact words if you remember them. I have a feeling we're going to need a detailed record of this incident. Harold looked around his living room at the photos of Dorothy, the grandchildren he rarely saw, the small American flag he displayed in his window every Veterans Day. This wasn't the America he'd fought for in Korea. But maybe, with the right phone call to the right person, it could still become the America he'd dreamed of. I'll write it all down. Bobby, every word. Good, and Harold, you did the right thing calling me. This isn't going to be swept under the rug or forgotten about. I promise you that. After they hung up, Harold sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time in hours, he felt something other than anger and humiliation. He felt hope. General Robert Chen was about to remind some people that Harold Washington wasn't just any 90-year-old black man eating breakfast in a diner. He was an American veteran who'd earned his place at any table in any restaurant in the country. And sometimes, when you've served your country with honor, your country serves you right back. General Robert Chen hung up the phone and sat in silence for exactly 30 seconds. Then he reached for his secure line and began making calls that would change everything for Harold Washington, Betty's Corner Diner, and the small police department that had made a very big mistake. The first call went to his aide, Colonel Patricia Martinez, who had been working with veterans issues for over a decade. Her voice was crisp and professional when she answered. Colonel Martinez speaking. Patricia, I need you to cancel my afternoon meetings. All of them. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. Within minutes, Colonel Martinez was in General Chen's office, notepad ready. The general briefed her on Harold Washington's phone call, watching her expression grow darker with each detail. Sir, this is absolutely unacceptable, she said when he finished. A Purple Heart recipient treated like a common criminal for eating breakfast? It gets worse, General Chen said, pulling up information on his computer. I've been looking into Harold Washington's service record. This man didn't just serve in Korea. He served with distinction. Bronze Star Purple Heart Commendation for bravery under fire. He saved 3 wounded soldiers during a mortar attack and spent 2 months in a field hospital recovering from shrapnel wounds. Colonel Martinez shook her head in disgust, and some police officers made him stand up and searched him in public because someone thought he looked suspicious. General Chen's next call was to the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office. If this story got out, and with people recording on cell phones it would definitely get out, the military needed to be ready with a clear, strong response. Major Thompson? This is General Chen. I need you to prepare a statement regarding the mistreatment of a Korean War veteran by local police. Yes, it happened this morning. Yes, it's going to be a problem. The third call was the most important one. General Chen dialed the direct line to Police Chief William Rodriguez, the man in charge of the department that employed the 2 officers who had humiliated Harold Washington. Chief Rodriguez answered on the second ring. Rodriguez here. Chief Rodriguez, this is General Robert Chen calling from the Pentagon's Veterans Affairs Liaison Office. I believe 2 of your officers had an encounter this morning with a 90-year-old Korean War veteran named Harold Washington. There was a pause on the other end of the line. General Chen? From the Pentagon? Sir, Yes, I believe there was some kind of incident at a local diner this morning, but I haven't received a full report yet. Then let me provide you with one, General Chen said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded thousands of troops in combat zones. 2 of your officers responded to a complaint about a suspicious person at Betty's Corner Diner. The suspicious person turned out to be Harold Washington, a decorated Purple Heart recipient who has eaten breakfast at the same table every Tuesday morning for 15 years. Chief Rodriguez's voice became more cautious. General, if there's been some kind of misunderstanding, your officers forced Mr. Washington to stand and submit to a public search while he was eating breakfast. They questioned the authenticity of his Purple Heart. They treated a war hero like a criminal in front of people who have known and respected him for years, and the silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When Chief Rodriguez finally spoke, his voice was tight with concern. General Chen, if what you're telling me is accurate, then my officers made some serious errors in judgment. But I need to investigate this properly. Get statements from everyone involved. Chief Rodriguez, General Chen interrupted. Let me be very clear about something. Harold Washington didn't call the local newspaper or file a complaint with your department. He called me personally because we served together in Korea, and he knew I would understand the gravity of what happened to him. General Chen paused to let that sink in before continuing. What this means is that you now have the Pentagon's Veterans Affairs Liaison Office taking a direct interest in how your department treats America's veterans. Is that really the kind of attention you want? Chief Rodriguez's response was immediate. No, sir, it absolutely is not. General, what can I do to make this right? You can start by suspending the 2 officers involved pending a full investigation. You can personally apologize to Mr. Washington for the treatment he received, and you can implement immediate training for all your officers on proper procedures when dealing with elderly citizens and veterans. Consider it done, General. All of it. Those officers will be suspended within the hour, and I'll personally visit Mr. Washington to apologize. But General Chen wasn't finished. His next call was to the regional FBI office, where he spoke with Agent-in-Charge Rebecca Stone about potential civil rights violations. The call after that went to the Department of Veterans Affairs, alerting them to a case that might require their intervention. Within 2 hours of Harold's phone call, the story was spreading through official channels. The Pentagon's Public Affairs Office had prepared talking points. The VA was reviewing policies for supporting veterans who faced discrimination. The FBI was considering whether federal civil rights laws had been violated, but perhaps more importantly, the story was spreading through unofficial channels too. General Chen had served with distinction for 32 years, and he had friends and colleagues throughout the military and veteran communities. A quiet word here, a discreet phone call there, and suddenly everyone seemed to know about Harold Washington. Colonel Martinez knocked on General Chen's door around 3 p.m. "Sir, you need to see this." She handed him a tablet showing the Pentagon's official Twitter account. Someone in public affairs had posted a statement that was already being shared thousands of times. The Pentagon stands with all veterans who have served our nation with honor. Recent reports of a Korean War Purple Heart recipient being mistreated while peacefully eating breakfast are deeply concerning. Every veteran deserves to be treated with the respect they earned through their service to America. The post had hundreds of comments, most from active military personnel and veterans expressing outrage and support for Harold. But it was the replies from official accounts that really caught General Chen's attention. The Secretary of Defense had retweeted it with a comment. "Unacceptable. Our veterans deserve better." The chairman of the Joint Chiefs had shared it with his own statement. "We will always stand up for those who stood up for America." Even the White House's official account had weighed in. "All Americans, especially our veterans, have the right to live with dignity and respect." General Chen's phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. "General Chen, this is Frank Morrison from CNN. We understand there was an incident involving a Korean War veteran, and we'd like to get your comment." And that's when General Chen realized that Harold Washington's phone call had started something much bigger than either of them had expected. The story was about to go national, and there would be no hiding what had happened at Betty's Corner Diner. By 6 p.m., General Chen's office was fielding calls from major news networks, veterans organizations, and civil rights groups. Harold Washington's story was trending on social media. Under the hashtag #RespectOurVeterans, the 2 police officers who had humiliated a 90-year-old war hero were about to discover that actions have consequences, especially when those actions target someone who has friends in very high places. General Chen made one final call of the day, back to Harold Washington's home phone. "Harold, it's Bobby. I wanted to let you know that things are moving very quickly on your situation. How quickly? Harold asked. Well, let me put it this way. In about 30 minutes, Chief Rodriguez is going to knock on your door to personally apologize for what his officers did to you. The 2 officers involved have been suspended pending investigation. And I'm pretty sure you're going to be hearing from some reporters very soon. Harold was quiet for a moment. Bobby, I just wanted them to treat me with respect. I didn't want all this attention. Harold, sometimes respect requires attention. Sometimes the only way to make sure something like this doesn't happen again is to make sure everyone knows it happened in the first place. General Chen looked out his office window at the Pentagon's parking lot, where American flags flew at full staff in the evening breeze. Besides, he added, you earned this attention 70 years ago when you put on a uniform and served your country. It just took this long for people to pay it. The next morning, Harold Washington's story would be on the front page of newspapers across the country. But tonight, it was just 2 old soldiers making sure that service to America still meant something in a small-town diner. By Wednesday morning, the story of Harold Washington's humiliation at Betty's Corner Diner had traveled far beyond the small town where it happened. Social media posts were being shared thousands of times per hour. News trucks were parked outside the diner. And Harold's phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke on the evening news. But the most remarkable response came from an unexpected source: the veteran community itself. It started with a single post on a Facebook group for Korean War veterans. Someone had shared a news article about Harold's story with a simple comment: "This could have been any of us." Within hours, the post had hundreds of responses from veterans of all ages. Many shared their own stories of being treated with disrespect or suspicion. Others expressed outrage that a decorated war hero had been subjected to such humiliation. But one comment caught everyone's attention. "I say we show up at Betty's Corner Diner next Tuesday morning. Let's make sure Harold Washington knows he's not alone." The idea spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, what had started as one veteran's suggestion had become a grassroots movement. Veterans from 3 states were making plans to drive to Harold's small town. Social media groups were coordinating carpools. Local VFW posts were chartering buses. Betty Henderson, the diner's owner, watched the news coverage from her small office behind the kitchen. She'd owned the restaurant for 23 years, serving coffee and comfort food to truckers, families, and regulars like Harold Washington. She'd never seen anything like this. Her phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Curiosity seekers wanted reservations. And dozens of veterans were calling to ask if they could hold their support gathering at her diner. "Of course you can," Betty told each caller. "Harold Washington has family here. Anyone who wants to support him is welcome." Lisa, the waitress who'd served Harold every Tuesday for years, was fielding her own flood of calls and messages. The video someone had taken of Harold being searched had gone viral, and Lisa's defense of her longtime customer had made her an unlikely hero in the story. "I just did what any decent person would do," she told a reporter from the local news station. Mr. Washington deserved to be treated with respect. He earned that respect in Korea, and he's earned it again every Tuesday morning for 15 years by being nothing but kind and polite to everyone he meets. By Friday, the scope of what was being planned for the following Tuesday became clear. The local VFW post estimated that over 300 veterans were expected to show up at Betty's Corner Diner. They were coming from as far away as Chicago and Atlanta, driving through the night to stand with Harold Washington. The mayor's office called an emergency meeting. The small diner that normally served maybe 50 customers on a busy morning was about to be overwhelmed by hundreds of people. Traffic control would be needed. Parking would be impossible. The whole downtown area was going to be chaos. But Mayor Jennifer Walsh, herself the daughter of a Vietnam veteran, made a decision that surprised everyone. "We're going to help make this work," she announced at the town council meeting. "We're closing Main Street to traffic from 7 a.m. to noon on Tuesday. We're setting up shuttle buses from the high school parking lot. We're bringing in portable restrooms and extra security. Harold Washington served our country with honor, and our town is going to serve him with honor too." Betty Henderson realized her small diner wouldn't be able to handle the crowd, so she made her own decision. She called every restaurant owner in town and asked if they wanted to participate in what she started calling Honor Harold Day. The response was overwhelming. Every restaurant, cafe, and food truck in town volunteered to serve breakfast at cost to any veteran who showed up on Tuesday morning. The high school's culinary arts program offered to help prepare food. Local grocery stores donated supplies. Even the fire department volunteered to set up grills in the town park. Harold Washington watched all of this unfold from his living room, overwhelmed by the response to his story. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, but he'd given only one interview, to the local newspaper that had covered his weekly diner visits for years. "I never wanted this to become about me," he told the reporter. "I just wanted to be treated with the same respect that any customer deserves. But if my story helps other people understand what respect looks like, then maybe something good can come from something bad." On Sunday evening, 2 days before the planned gathering, Harold received a phone call that surprised him. "Mr. Washington, this is Lieutenant Colonel James Bradley. I'm calling from Fort Campbell in Kentucky." Harold recognized the name of the major army base. "What can I do for you, Colonel?" "Sir, it's what we can do for you. I have 43 soldiers from my battalion who are driving up Tuesday morning to join the gathering at Betty's Corner Diner. These are active duty soldiers who wanted you to know that today's military stands with yesterday's heroes." Harold felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Colonel, that's very kind, but I don't need—" "With respect, sir," the colonel interrupted, "this isn't about what you need. This is about what we need. We need to show you the respect that should have been shown in the first place. We need to remind ourselves and everyone else what service to country means. And we need to make sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to any other veteran." By Monday night, the small town was buzzing with activity. Veterans had been arriving throughout the day, checking into local hotels and bed and breakfasts. Many were elderly Korean War veterans like Harold, but there were also younger veterans from Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. At the local VFW post, newly arrived veterans shared stories and connected with old friends. Some hadn't seen each other in decades. Others were meeting for the first time, bonded by shared service and outrage over Harold's treatment. Frank Morrison, a 78-year-old Marine who'd served in Vietnam, had driven 12 hours from Florida to be there. "When I saw that video of them searching Harold Washington like he was a criminal, it made me sick to my stomach," he told a reporter. "That man earned the right to eat breakfast anywhere he wants without being hassled by cops who probably never served a day in their lives." The 2 police officers involved in Harold's incident had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Neither would comment publicly, but their lawyer issued a statement saying they had responded appropriately to a citizen complaint and followed department procedures. The statement only made veterans angrier. Police Chief Rodriguez, who had personally apologized to Harold Washington as General Chen had demanded, found himself in an impossible position. Half the town was angry at his officers for their treatment of Harold. The other half was angry at him for suspending the officers without a full investigation. "This has gotten way out of hand," he complained to the mayor. "It was a simple misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by social media and the news." Mayor Walsh looked at him with cold eyes. "Chief, what's gotten out of hand is the way a decorated war hero was treated in our community. What we're seeing now is people trying to fix what your officers broke." Tuesday morning dawned clear and crisp. Perfect weather for what everyone was calling Honor Harold Day. By 6 a.m., 2 hours before Harold normally arrived at Betty's Corner Diner, veterans were already gathering in the town square. They came in wheelchairs and on walkers, wearing their service caps and displaying their unit patches. Some carried small American flags. Others wore their dress uniforms, medals gleaming in the morning sun. Harold Washington got dressed carefully that Tuesday morning, putting on his best cardigan and making sure his purple heart pin was perfectly positioned. He'd decided to keep his regular appointment at Betty's Corner Diner, despite all the chaos swirling around his story. At 8:45 a.m., he drove slowly down Main Street, amazed by what he saw. Hundreds of veterans lined the sidewalks, applauding as his car passed. News crews filmed from every corner. American flags flew from every lamppost. When Harold pulled into the diner's parking lot, now expanded to include the entire town square, he was greeted by a sight that took his breath away. Veterans of all ages stood in formation, saluting as he got out of his car. At the front of the group was Lieutenant Colonel Bradley and his 43 active-duty soldiers, their dress uniforms crisp and perfect. As Harold slowly walked toward the diner's entrance, leaning heavily on his cane, the crowd began to sing. Not the national anthem or a military song, but Happy Birthday, because someone had discovered that Harold Washington was celebrating his 91st birthday that week. For the first time since the incident that started it all, Harold Washington smiled. Really smiled. These weren't strangers showing up for a photo opportunity. These were his brothers and sisters in arms, making sure he knew that he wasn't alone, that his service mattered, and that respect wasn't something he had to beg for. It was something he'd earned. The national attention surrounding Harold Washington's story brought consequences that reached far beyond the small diner where it all began. Within a week of Honor Harold Day, investigators from multiple agencies were digging deep into the police department's practices, and what they found was disturbing. The FBI Civil Rights Division had opened a formal investigation into the incident, but their inquiry quickly expanded as more stories emerged. Other elderly residents came forward with their own accounts of being treated with suspicion or disrespect by the same two officers who had humiliated Harold. Mrs. Grace Kim, an 82-year-old woman who lived alone downtown, told investigators that Officer Blake Thompson, the blonde officer who'd searched Harold, had questioned her for loitering while she waited for the bus outside the pharmacy where she'd just picked up her medications. He treated me like I was doing something wrong. Mrs. Kim explained to the FBI agent taking her statement, "I had my prescription bag in my hand, my bus pass in my wallet, and I was standing at the official bus stop. But he made me feel like a criminal for being old and Korean in public." 3 other elderly residents shared similar stories. All involved the same 2 officers. All involved elderly people of color being treated with suspicion for routine activities like shopping, waiting for rides, or simply walking in their own neighborhoods. The pattern was clear, and it was damning. Chief Rodriguez found himself facing pressure from every direction. The FBI investigation was expanding daily. The state police had launched their own review of his department's training procedures. The Pentagon's Veterans Affairs Office was still asking pointed questions about how his officers treated decorated war heroes. But perhaps most damaging was the internal investigation that revealed the original phone call reporting Harold as suspicious had come from someone who admitted they'd never actually seen him do anything wrong. The caller, a local businessman named Derek Hoffman, had been recorded on the 911 call saying, "There's this old black guy who comes to the diner every week and I just think it's weird. He sits there for a long time reading the newspaper, and it makes some customers uncomfortable." When pressed by investigators, Hoffman couldn't identify a single customer who'd complained or point to anything Harold had actually done wrong. He'd simply decided that an elderly black man's presence was inherently suspicious. The recording of that call, leaked to the media, sparked another wave of outrage. Social media exploded with people sharing their own stories of being reported to police for suspicious activities like jogging while black, shopping while black, or in Harold's case, eating breakfast while Black District Attorney Patricia Wells announced that her office would review the incident for possible criminal charges. "Making false reports to police is a crime," she said at a press conference. "When those false reports lead to the harassment and humiliation of law-abiding citizens, especially elderly veterans, we take that very seriously." Derek Hoffman's business, a small insurance agency, began losing customers immediately. Negative reviews flooded his Google page and Yelp account. Veterans groups organized a boycott. Within 2 weeks, he'd lost so many clients that he was forced to close his office. Meanwhile, the 2 officers at the center of the controversy were facing their own reckoning. Officer Blake Thompson, the blonde officer who'd searched Harold, had been with the department for 3 years. His partner, Officer Mike Rodriguez, no relation to the police chief, had been on the force for 5 years. Internal Affairs reviewed their personnel files and found troubling patterns. Both officers had received multiple complaints about aggressive behavior during routine encounters. Both had been involved in incidents where citizens claimed they'd been treated disrespectfully or unfairly. Most significantly, neither officer had received proper training on interacting with elderly citizens or veterans, despite state requirements that all police officers complete such training within their first year of service. The police department's training records revealed a systemic problem. Budget cuts over the past 5 years had eliminated most continuing education programs. Officers were no longer receiving regular updates on de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, or proper procedures for handling calls involving vulnerable populations. State investigators found that the department hadn't conducted veteran awareness training in over 8 years. Despite having a significant veteran population in their jurisdiction, they discovered that neither Thompson nor Rodriguez could identify common military decorations or understand their significance. They didn't know what a Purple Heart was. General Chen told a congressional hearing that was convened to examine veteran services issues. They questioned its authenticity because they'd never been trained to recognize legitimate military honors. The hearing, broadcast live on C-SPAN, featured Harold Washington as the lead witness. Despite his age and the stress of national attention, Harold testified with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the ordeal. "I didn't serve my country to get special treatment," Harold told the congressmen and women. "I served because it was my duty. But every American citizen, veteran or not, deserves to be treated with basic respect by the people sworn to protect them." His testimony was interrupted multiple times by applause from the packed hearing room, filled with veterans and their families who'd traveled to Washington, D.C. to support him. Congressman Michael Torres, himself a Navy veteran, asked Harold directly what changes he thought were needed. "Training," Harold said without hesitation. "These officers need to understand that their job is to serve the community, not intimidate it. They need to know that being old, being black, being different from them doesn't make someone suspicious, and they need to understand that veterans, all veterans, earned their place in American society through service and sacrifice." The consequences came swiftly after Harold's testimony. Within 48 hours, the state legislature passed emergency funding for mandatory police training programs. Every officer in the state would be required to complete annual training on interactions with elderly citizens, veterans, and other vulnerable populations. The federal government announced new grants to help local police departments improve their community relations programs. The Department of Veterans Affairs created a new rapid response system for veterans facing discrimination or mistreatment, but the most direct consequences fell on the 2 officers who'd started it all. Officer Blake Thompson was terminated. After the internal investigation concluded, he'd violated multiple department policies during his encounter with Harold. His behavior had been unnecessarily aggressive. His search was conducted without proper justification, and his questioning of Harold's military service had crossed the line into harassment. Officer Mike Rodriguez was suspended without pay for 6 months and demoted to probationary status. He would be required to complete extensive retraining before returning to patrol duties, and any future complaints about his behavior would result in immediate termination. Chief Rodriguez, facing calls for his resignation from veterans groups and community leaders, announced he would retire at the end of the year. "I take full responsibility for the failures in training and supervision that led to this incident," he said at his final press conference. "Mr. Washington deserved better from this department, and I failed to ensure he received it." The new police chief, hired from outside the department, would be a former military officer with extensive experience in community policing and veteran services. Derek Hoffman, the businessman whose phone call had started the entire incident, faced his own consequences. The district attorney's office charged him with filing a false police report, a misdemeanor that carried potential jail time and fines. More significantly, Harold Washington's attorney filed a civil rights lawsuit against Hoffman, the police department, and the city. The case would eventually settle for an undisclosed amount, but sources close to the negotiations suggested the settlement was substantial enough to fund Harold's care for the rest of his life and establish a scholarship fund for disadvantaged veterans. But perhaps the most meaningful consequence wasn't financial or legal. It was the change in how the community treated its elderly residents and veterans. Betty's Corner Diner became an unofficial gathering place for local veterans. Every Tuesday morning, a group of former service members would meet for coffee and conversation, sharing stories and supporting each other. The Harold Washington Memorial Table, the corner booth where it all started, became a place of honor where veterans could sit and know they were among friends. Local schools began inviting elderly veterans to speak to students about their service. The library started a veteran oral history project. The annual Veterans Day Parade, which had been canceled for 3 years due to lack of participation, was revived and became the biggest community event of the year. 6 months after Harold Washington was humiliated for eating breakfast while black, his small town had become a model for how communities should honor and protect their veterans. The change hadn't come from government mandates or policy papers, but from ordinary people deciding that respect and dignity weren't optional. They were fundamental rights that every citizen, especially those who'd served their country, deserved to enjoy. 1 year after the incident that changed everything, Harold Washington sat in his familiar corner booth at Betty's Corner Diner, but nothing else was quite the same. The small brass plaque on the table read, "Harold Washington Memorial Table, in honor of service and dignity." And every Tuesday morning, it was surrounded by friends. Frank Morrison, the Vietnam veteran who'd driven from Florida for the original support gathering, had moved to town permanently. He sat across from Harold, sharing stories about his grandchildren and his new volunteer work at the VA hospital. Next to him, Lieutenant Colonel Bradley, who'd retired from active duty, was helping coordinate a new mentorship program for young veterans transitioning to civilian life. Lisa still served Harold his coffee, but now she also served a dozen other veterans who'd made Tuesday morning at Betty's a weekly tradition. The diner had expanded into the space next door to accommodate the regular crowd, and Betty Henderson had hired 3 more staff members to handle the increased business. "Never thought I'd say this," Betty told Harold as she refilled his coffee cup. "But having all you troublemakers around every week has been the best thing that ever happened to this place." Harold smiled, adjusting his purple heart pin, the same pin that officers had once questioned as potentially fake. Now it served as a conversation starter with young people who wanted to hear about Korea, about service, about what it meant to serve your country. The changes went far beyond the diner. Harold had become, somewhat reluctantly, a symbol of dignity in the face of injustice. His story was taught in police academies across the country as an example of how simple bias and poor training could escalate into national incidents. His testimony to Congress had been turned into training materials used by law enforcement agencies nationwide. But Harold was most proud of the changes in his own community. The new police chief, Chief Patricia Williams, was a retired Army colonel who'd served 3 tours overseas. She'd implemented community policing programs that had officers walking beats, attending community events, and building relationships with residents rather than just responding to calls. Officer Thompson, who'd searched Harold that day, had found work in another state after being fired. Officer Rodriguez had completed his retraining and remained on the force, but he was a different officer now. He'd personally apologized to Harold and had become one of the department's most active participants in veteran outreach programs. People can change, Harold told a reporter who was writing a follow-up story on the anniversary of the incident. The question is whether they want to. Officer Rodriguez wanted to become better, so he did. Officer Thompson didn't, so he moved on. Sometimes that's how progress works, one person at a time. Derek Hoffman, the businessman whose phone call had started everything, had left town after his insurance agency failed. But even there, Harold had chosen compassion over bitterness. That man let fear and prejudice guide his actions. Harold explained to his weekly breakfast companions. He paid a price for that. But carrying anger toward him would only poison my own heart. I'd rather focus on the good that came from his mistake. The good was substantial. The Harold Washington Veteran Dignity Act, passed by Congress 6 months after his testimony, had allocated federal funding for police training programs specifically focused on interactions with veterans and elderly citizens. Every police department in America now had access to training, materials developed in consultation with veteran organizations and civil rights groups. The small town had become an unlikely pilgrimage site for veterans and their families. They came to eat at Betty's Corner Diner, to sit in Harold's booth, to hear his story from the man himself. Harold welcomed them all, sharing coffee and conversation with anyone who wanted to talk about service, sacrifice, and the ongoing struggle for dignity and respect. The high school had established the Harold Washington Scholarship, funded partially by his legal settlement, for students who volunteered with elderly veterans. The recipients had to spend time each week at the VA hospital, the senior center, or with elderly veterans in their homes, learning their stories and helping with daily tasks. Young people need to understand that we're not just old folks taking up space, Harold told the first group of scholarship recipients. We're living history books. We've seen this country change, we've helped it change, and we have stories that can teach you about courage, perseverance, and hope. Dr. Rachel Martinez, the local high school principal, had watched her students transform through their interactions with elderly veterans. These kids come back from their volunteer hours different, she explained. They've heard firsthand accounts of historical events. They've learned about sacrifice and service, and they've developed genuine relationships with people they might have otherwise overlooked. The annual Veterans Day celebration in Haroldstown had grown from a small parade to a week-long festival that drew visitors from across the region. Harold served as the honorary Grand Marshal every year, riding in a convertible and waving to crowds who cheered not just for him, but for all the veterans his story had helped people remember and honor. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the quietest one. Harold no longer ate breakfast alone on Tuesdays. His corner booth was surrounded by friends, fellow veterans, and young people who'd learned that respect wasn't something you gave based on someone's age or color or background. It was something you gave because they were human beings who deserved dignity. General Robert Chen, now retired but still Harold's friend, visited every few months. They would sit together at the famous booth, two old soldiers reflecting on how far the country had come and how far it still had to go. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Harold told the general during one of these visits. "I think about that young man I was in Korea, so scared and so far from home. If you'd told him that someday he'd be sitting in a diner, surrounded by friends, having helped change how police officers treat veterans across the whole country, he never would have believed it." General Chen smiled. "That young man in Korea was already a hero, Harold. He just didn't know it yet. Sometimes it takes 70 years for the rest of the world to catch up." On quiet mornings when Harold ate breakfast alone, which was rare now, he would sometimes think about Dorothy, his late wife, and wonder what she would have made of all the attention and change. She'd always told him he was too modest, too willing to let things slide when he should speak up. "I finally spoke up, Dorothy," he would whisper to himself, looking at her picture in his wallet. "Took me 90 years, but I finally spoke up." The impact of Harold Washington's story continued to ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted. Police departments used his case study and training. Veterans advocates referenced his experience when pushing for better treatment. Civil rights organizations pointed to his dignity under pressure as an example of how to respond to injustice. But Harold himself remained focused on the simple things: his Tuesday morning breakfasts, his friends at the diner, his conversations with young people who wanted to understand what service meant. He'd never wanted to be famous, never wanted to be a symbol, never wanted to be anything more than an old man who could eat breakfast in peace. Yet his legacy was profound. Across the country, elderly veterans sat in diners and restaurants knowing that their service was recognized and respected. Police officers approached all citizens, but especially elderly ones, with more training, more awareness, and more respect. Young people learned about veterans' stories and contributions through programs inspired by Harold's example. On his 92nd birthday, Harold Washington sat in his corner booth at Betty's Corner Diner, surrounded by dozens of friends, family members who'd flown in from across the country, and veterans who'd become his chosen family. The mayor presented him with a key to the city. The governor sent a proclamation declaring it Harold Washington Day throughout the state. But the gift that meant the most came from a group of elementary school students who'd been learning about Korean War veterans. They'd made him a card, signed by all 32 students in the class, that simply said, "Thank you, Mr. Washington, for showing us that being brave isn't just for young people." As Harold looked around the room at all the faces, young and old, different colors and backgrounds united by respect and friendship, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had started with humiliation and injustice, but it had led to connection, understanding, and change. He'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept being treated with anything less than the dignity you deserve. And sometimes when you stand up for yourself, you end up standing up for everyone who comes after you. Harold Washington had served his country as a young man in Korea, but his greatest service came 70 years later, when he picked up the phone and refused to let injustice have the last word. In doing so, he'd reminded America that respect isn't earned through youth or wealth or power. It's earned through character, service, and the simple courage to stand up and say, "I deserve better than this," And America, slowly but surely, was learning to listen.